Picture the British Empire at its peak. Read across every map. Royal Navy ships owning the oceans. London calling the shots for half the planet. Your history teacher probably told you it was discipline, naval genius, and some vague idea of bringing civilization to the world that made all of this happen. That's the comfortable version. Here's the real one. Britain didn't conquer the world on guts alone. It conquered the world with capital, and a lot of that capital came from some deeply dark and morally disturbing places. We're talking about hidden financial networks, private fortunes built on human suffering, and a money machine that quietly powered the entire imperial project. Let's rewind to the 1600s. England at that point wasn't exactly a superpower. Spain and Portugal were drowning in New World gold. The Dutch were dominating global trade. France had land and resources for days. England, relatively small, frequently broke, and politically a mess. So how does this scrappy island nation end up ruling a quarter of the Earth's surface? Simple answer: it figured out how to weaponize money. In 1694, Britain did something revolutionary. It created the Bank of England. And this wasn't just another government institution. This was a financial invention that changed everything. Before this, kings had to beg nobles for money or squeeze it out of taxpayers. After 1694, the British government could borrow enormous sums from private investors in exchange for a guaranteed interest. Wars could now be fought on credit. An empire was expensive. Ships, soldiers, fortifications, and administering colonies drained cash at insane rates. With access to London's new financial markets, Britain could outspend any rival on the planet. Debt became fuel for conquest. And here's the kicker: much of that money wasn't clean. Private companies essentially acted as arms of the state. The biggest example: the East India Company, arguably the most powerful and dangerous corporation in human history. Founded in 1600, it wasn't just a business trading spices and silk. It raised its own armies, signed international treaties, and ran entire territories. Backed by London investors, it monopolized goods, manipulated local economies, and ultimately taxed tens of millions of people across India. Shareholders back home weren't just collecting dividends, they were bankrolling empire. Private profit funding public power. That's a line that should make you uncomfortable. Here's where the story gets even darker. The British Empire leaned heavily on the transatlantic slave trade. From the 1600s through the early 1800s, British ships transported millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The human cost was incomprehensible. But from the cold, ruthless lens of finance, this system generated staggering, almost unimaginable wealth. Caribbean sugar plantations were among the most profitable operations on Earth at the time. Cash flooded back into London banks. Insurance companies underwrote slave voyages. Entire family fortunes were built on this system, fortunes that later funded naval fleets, stately country estates, and further colonial expansion. Even when slavery was abolished in 1833, the financial rot continued. The British government compensated slave owners for their losses, not the enslaved people, the owners. That money stayed in circulation, folded right back into the empire's financial bloodstream. Think about that. Abolitionism was a moral victory, but financially, the system barely skipped a beat. If you think of the British Empire as a giant machine, the real gears weren't turned by generals or politicians. They were turned by banking dynasties like the Rothschilds, whose credit arrangements kept governments solvent and armies supplied, by insurance giants like Lloyd's of London, which made fortunes covering risky colonial voyages including slave ships, by a rising merchant class speculating on everything from Indian textiles to Chinese tea. This wasn't some chaotic free market at work. It was a tightly coordinated web of capital, fusing Britain's financial markets to its imperial ambitions. By the 1700s, London wasn't just the political capital of Britain, it was the financial capital of the entire world. Foreign monarchs borrowed there. Global trade was priced there. Colonial companies floated their shares there. Wars that might have bankrupted France or Spain became manageable for Britain because its debt was spread among thousands of investors. Risk was socialized. Profits were private. Soldiers bled on battlefields while financiers clipped coupons whether the campaign succeeded or failed. Want a perfect example of dark money in action? The Opium Wars. Britain was burning through silver to pay for Chinese tea and couldn't close the trade gap. So what did it do? It started pushing opium grown in India, smuggled into China with government backing. Millions of Chinese people got addicted. An entire society was and when China tried to stop the trade, Britain sent in warships and forced them to comply. This was state-backed drug trafficking on an imperial scale. And the profits didn't just enrich individual smugglers, they flowed back into London's financial system, funding further expansion. Meanwhile, India became what economists today might call the empire's ATM. After Britain took direct control of India in the mid-1800s, taxed revenue from Indian farmers didn't stay in India. It got funneled through London banks, converted into sterling, and used to fund British military operations in Africa, infrastructure projects across the empire, and interest payments to British bond. Indian economist Adibhai Naoroji called it the drain of wealth, and he was right. Modern estimates suggest billions were systematically extracted from India annually, with almost nothing reinvested locally. London bankers loved it. Guaranteed income stream, stable returns, the human cost in famines and poverty. Just noise on the balance sheet. The so-called scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. That wasn't just colonial powers planting flags and drawing borders on maps. It was a financial feeding frenzy. Mining companies floated on the London Stock Exchange promised fortunes from South African diamonds and Transvaal gold. Investors piled in and speculators made bets. Then the British Army moved in behind them to make sure those investments were protected. No coincidence that the Anglo-Zulu War and the Boer War erupted right after major resource discoveries. Finance demanded security for its investments. An empire delivered no matter the cost in lives, African or British. The Industrial Revolution added even more rocket fuel to this machine. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham needed raw materials and export markets. Empire solved both problems. Banks financed cotton shipments. Insurers covered risk on tea cargoes from Ceylon. Stock markets buzzed with mining company shares. Every transaction tied colonial exploitation to financial returns back home. By the early 20th century, the cracks were forming. Germany and the United States were industrializing at explosive speed. New banks, new financial systems, and new rivals began chipping away at London's dominance. Britain's response? Double down. Squeeze the colonies harder. Force them to hold British sterling as reserve currency and conduct trade through London banks. World War I was the ultimate stress test, and Britain failed it financially. Funding 4 years of brutal, unprecedented warfare required more money than the Bank of England could generate alone. Britain borrowed massively from the United States. For the first time in centuries, London wasn't the creditor to the world, it was the debtor. The empire that built its rise on lending had become dependent on Wall Street to survive. After the war, Britain tried to restore its old financial glory. It reimposed the gold standard, propped up sterling, and extracted even more from its colonies to stabilize its balance sheets. India bore the worst of it. Grain was exported during famines to keep Britain's economy afloat. Tax burdens remained crushing. Nationalist movements in India, Egypt, and across Africa began directly confronting the financial exploitation holding the empire together. Then the Great Depression hit. Global trade collapsed. Sterling stumbled. Britain's debt load became impossible to hide. World War II drove the final nail. Britain mortgaged its empire again, this time catastrophically. By 1945, it owed billions to the United States and was forced into the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, which came with heavy strings attached. The financial center of gravity shifted decisively from London to Washington. The dollar replaced sterling as a world's reserve currency. Britain's era as the world's banker was over. Here's where it gets really interesting for us today. The British Empire formally ended. The Union Jack came down. Independence was granted. But the financial infrastructure that stuck around. Former colonies inherited financial systems designed to serve London, not local populations. Debt burdens, currency dependencies, rigged trade relationships, these continued long after the political empire dissolved. The wealth kept flowing from the global south to western financial centers, just through different mechanisms. And in Britain itself, the financial sector never lost its grip. If anything, the decline of empire supercharged London's transformation into a new kind of global dark money hub. Former British territories like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Jersey became offshore tax havens, extensions of the City of London, providing secrecy and shelter for global capital. Where Britain once extracted wealth through trade monopolies and colonial taxation, it now does so through financial opacity and offshore banking. The empire formally ended. The logic of dark money absolutely did not. So, here's the big picture. Britain's rise to becoming the most powerful empire in history was never really about bravery, innovation, or a civilizing mission. It was about balance sheets, bonds, debt, hidden capital flows. Every battle won, every colony governed, every treaty signed, behind it all was a financial calculation. designed to enrich a small elite while distributing the costs across the entire world. And the uncomfortable truth: the blueprint didn't disappear with the empire definanced warfare. Still happening. Corporations with government-level power. Still happening. Exploitation of cheap labor for profit. Still happening. Tax havens hiding dark money from public accountability. Still very much happening. British intellectual John Hobson argued over a century ago that imperialism isn't driven by national pride or noble ideals. It's driven by financiers looking for new places to invest. History has largely proved him right. A small financial elite dictated the trajectory of the largest empire in history, and similar dynamics are still shaping global power today. Nations rise and fall not just through military might, but through financial power, currencies, debt markets, offshore accounts. These are the empires of our age. The British Empire may be gone, but its legacy lives on every time wealth quietly flows from the many to the few, hidden behind the complexity of global finance. The next time someone talks about the glory of the British Empire, remember, behind the speeches and the statues stood money. Dark money. Built on slavery, narcotics, exploitation, and a banking system that treated human suffering as just another entry on a balance sheet. That's the real foundation, and it's a story that deserves to be told.